All right. So we last week talked about microbial ecology and nutrient cycling. And so this section is called Microbiology of the Built Environment. And basically what that means is it's looking at the microbes that have taken advantage of human processes. So these are things that perhaps microbes have been able to do, but because we've provided environments for them, they've been able to exploit these environments to become even more successful. And so one of the things that we have been able to use microbes for is for bioremediation, especially since the 1930s, 40s, when we developed nuclear weapons. We have a lot of waste products, including uranium. And in areas where uranium has been stored or processed, we often have contamination of the groundwater. And I don't know about you, but I would prefer to not drink uranium. Just, I'm picky, I guess. But there are microbes that can convert a soluble form of uranium, uranium 6+, to an insoluble form of uranium, uranium 4+. And so when that happens, the uranium basically precipitates out of the groundwater. So it doesn't remove the uranium from the groundwater. It's still there, but it contains it. So you now have basically solid uranium that can be removed during the water processing steps, I guess, before it gets to your house. So contamination of groundwater is a really significant concern. Here they give an example of uranium. If you've ever seen the movie Erin Brockovich, it's a true story of how PG&E processes contaminate groundwater with an element called chromium-6, I think. And again, if we had microbes that could remove those things from the groundwater, that would be really incredible. We also have things like arsenic and nitrates and sulfur that contaminate our groundwater. So I've taught this class before, and somebody said they live in one of the small towns, like outside of Fresno, and I can't remember which town it was, but that when they turn on their tap water, it smells like rotten eggs. Sulfur contamination. Hanford? Yeah, that's that. Okay. So if you live in Hanford, your water smells like rotten eggs. It's sulfur contamination. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about water processing as we go on, because of course water processing is a human invention, right? All of these water processing facilities, the ability to recycle our water in such a way that we can either put wastewater back into the environment or we can consume clean water. So uranium-contaminated areas can be cleaned up by microbes as well.
Do they do this conversion for metabolic?
Yeah, it's just a byproduct of their metabolism. I don't know what they use the uranium for in their metabolism, but they can basically put it into one of their normal metabolic processes. So they weren't engineered to do this. Yeah, that's a good point. These are not engineered microbes. We also talked a little bit in our microbial ecology about hydrocarbons, things like oil. And there are microbes that can degrade oil and break it down into less harmful contaminants. Some of those are naturally occurring microbes, and some of those have been genetically engineered to be better or to thrive in these other environments. Because when you think about, especially where we have the majority of our oil processing facilities and our oil transport, we're mostly talking about in the ocean, right? So where the water is kind of salty. We had the Deepwater Horizon, right, in the Gulf of Mexico where the water was warm, but we also had the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska where the water is cold. And we also have all of these pipelines running across the country that could be leaving oil behind in fields, right? Crop areas, contaminating groundwater. So we have to have microbes that can work in all of these different environments to help degrade hydrocarbons. So many organic pollutants, including hydrocarbons, can be degraded by microbes, all the way down to CO2. And what they're trying to show you here in this image is you've got some oil droplets. These are oil droplets. And you have all of these bacteria around, and they use them as an energy source, as like a food source, because they break them down, release the energy in the bonds, and release carbon dioxide as the byproduct. And we have used prokaryotes in the bioremediation of major oil spills. Again, we talked about that example of the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. And I know somebody said that Chevron is hiring microbiologists to develop biofuels. Chevron and other gas and oil companies also hire microbiologists to work on these types of organisms. In fact, the first living organism that was ever patented was a bacterium that was engineered to more efficiently degrade oil. So prior to that, no living thing could be patented, but the scientist who created it successfully argued that this did not exist in nature. I made it. Even though it is a living thing, I engineered it this way, and he was given the patent for that. So this is a process that has been important to scientists for a really long time. That was in the 70s or 80s. So the ability for microbes to degrade these products is really, really crucial. Now, where we run into issues are with compounds that we call xenobiotic compounds. These are synthetic, man-made compounds. They have never existed before. Hydrocarbons have existed before. That's why it's more likely to find microorganisms that can degrade hydrocarbons or can degrade uranium. These compounds have existed, not in the same concentrations that we use them now, not in the same way, but we have also generated compounds that have never ever been seen before, and so we can call them xenobiotic or synthetic compounds. And they give you some examples here: pesticides, polychlorinated biphenyls, munitions, dyes, chlorinated solvents, lots of our plastics. So because these compounds never existed before, they degrade and decompose very, very slowly because there really aren't microbes that have evolved to deal with them. Many microbes do not have the enzymes necessary to break down these novel compounds because they've never had to. They've never seen it before. Why would they know how to deal with it? So this is another area of exploration for people who are interested in microbiology but perhaps aren't interested in the medical aspects of microbiology. Can we engineer microbes, or can we force, in a way, the evolution of microbes that can utilize these novel pollutants as an energy source, as part of their normal metabolism, so that these compounds don't stay in the environment forever? I think I told you it's like something like baby diapers are in the landfill for like 10,000 years. So, you know, you had a nice little diaper, and that diaper is still sitting there somewhere in a landfill. Your kids, their kids, their kids, their kids, their kids, and those diapers are still going to be in the landfill. So if we could engineer microbes to degrade those compounds, it would be a really, really critical innovation. Again, here are some compounds that are novel, that never existed before, that microbes don't really know how to degrade. Up at the top, you have DDT, which is used often as a pesticide. And you have some of these chlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, all of these different compounds that are used for pesticides, herbicides, whatever, that cannot be degraded. And so when we talk about pesticides, one of the really critical negative features of pesticides is that they don't usually stay where they've been applied. And pesticides are a really, really common component of toxic waste. They get into the water supply, they get into the groundwater, Because imagine a giant field, right, of whatever your favorite crop is, and the farmer is going to spray pesticides because one of my favorites is strawberries, but I would prefer to have strawberries that weren't half eaten by bugs. I don't know about you, right? Not, again, I'm picky. I like to be the only one to eat my strawberry. I don't want to share with the bugs. But those pesticides or other herbicides to prevent weeds, right? Once the farmer irrigates, those soak into the ground and eventually can get into the groundwater. So herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. So a lot of our almond growers worry about fungal pathogens that destroy the trees. That's one of the hypotheses about what has been causing a lot of our issues with bees is the combination of fungicides and insecticides that get sprayed on almond crops. Individually, neither of those compounds are bad for bees. When you put them together, it kills them. So these novel compounds that have never existed and can't be degraded are causing really significant environmental concerns. Some of these compounds can be used as carbon sources by microorganisms. Some of them can serve as electron donors, so they do get modified and removed from the environment. But some of them are new and never been seen before, and they can't be degraded. So the idea would be if we could engineer microbes to maybe use them more efficiently, engineer more microbes that could use them, engineer new microbes that could use these new compounds. Again, you have that bioremediation, the removal of something dangerous from the environment through the use of another living organism. One of the other compounds that seems to cause a lot of issues through contamination and pollution are plastics. Plastics are new. Plastics are not readily degraded by microorganisms. And so one of the issues, or I guess new fields that has arisen because of the inability for microbes to degrade plastics is the generation of biodegradable alternatives. So polymers made from biological components instead of synthetic components, or plastics made from microorganisms, and plastics that can be degraded by microorganisms, right? So that's why when you go to the USU and you get a straw, it's made out of paper instead of plastic. Those things degrade really, really quickly. Yeah, I made that mistake. I won't be doing that again. Okay? So these things degrade, and then of course you won't see a sad picture of a sea turtle with a paper straw sticking out of its nose. The plastic stays around forever, but things like paper and other biopolymers can degrade more readily. And so here they're showing you some of the different compounds on top that don't degrade very well. PVC, Teflon, these things that you've probably heard of, that you have in your house, that you use on the daily. And then what they're showing down here is a shampoo bottle that's been made with bioplastics instead. So this one would be readily degradable. You shouldn't feel bad about putting it in the trash and letting it go to the landfill because it'll degrade, no problem. So again, these are avenues for exploration for people who are interested in microbiology to have alternative careers outside of medicine. So any questions about what we've discussed so far before we move on to one of the really, really important developments in public health that involves microbes? Yes?
How efficient is these bioplastics to produce?
They're not as efficient, right? So the question is, how efficient is it to produce these bioplastics? It's easier to produce regular plastic, and it's cheaper to produce regular plastic. So that's why, that shampoo may be equivalent to, your Suave or whatever, but you pay $2 for Suave at Target, and that one's going to cost you $10 at Whole Foods. So the cost goes on to the consumer, and as of right now, a lot of consumers are not willing to absorb that cost yet. But with any sort of industrial process, it gets cheaper and more efficient every time. And so the more and more people that demand things like this, the more likely it is that they'll continue to do so. Any other questions? Okay, so wastewater treatment. And I think this is not a debatable issue. In countries that have efficient wastewater treatment, you tend to see much higher socioeconomic status, higher GDP, increased lifespan. In countries that don't have efficient wastewater treatment, those are the countries that people will sometimes call developing countries, right? If they're really mean, they'll call them third world countries. But these are countries where the leading cause of death in children is diarrhea. So the leading cause of death in children under the age of 5 in countries without wastewater treatment is diarrhea. In the US, it's accidents. So wastewater treatment has improved lifespan, improved socioeconomic status, improves the ability for people to work, right? Could you think about, do you want to go to work if you have diarrhea? Right? Probably don't want to go to work even when you don't have diarrhea, but when you do have diarrhea, it makes it even worse, right? So the ability to have clean drinking water, clean bathing water, to not worry, I can open up a tap. I don't like the tap water, but I could. I could open up the tap and drink from it. I'm going to be fine. I can brush my teeth and I'm going to be fine. I can get ice in my beverage and I'm going to be fine. In other countries, that is not the case. And so when we have wastewater treatment, we avoid things like cholera. Water is one of the most common sources of disease, right? That's why they tell you if you go to certain countries, don't drink the water, don't brush your teeth with the water, don't get ice in your drink, because you'll get diarrhea. So things like cholera are commonly found in contaminated water. One of the other things that can get in the water are chemicals. That's more common here. We don't usually have things like cholera in our water supply. But chemicals, sure, right? In Hanford, it smells like sulfur. In some places, it probably tastes like chlorine. You can taste or smell the chemicals that are in the water. And if the water is contaminated, let's say you're downstream of some sort of agricultural operation, that can be even higher levels of chemicals. So in Flint, right, their water supply is completely contaminated with lead. So these chemicals that get in the water supply, can really dramatically negatively impact the quality of life in these areas. So ensuring the quality of water purity is completely essential for public health. Because what do we tell you? It's cold and flu season. Wash your hands. What, with cholera water? What's that going to do? So maybe you won't get a cold or the flu, but you'll get cholera. So the ability to have clean water is absolutely essential. And so in our processes for treating and cleaning water, we often use microorganisms. Microorganisms can tell us if the water is contaminated, because if there's a lot of organic pollutants, you'll see a huge influx of the numbers of microorganisms. They can remove pollutants, and they can degrade pollutants. And so there's a couple of different kinds of water and wastewater that we'll talk about. So with wastewater, generally what we're referring to is domestic sewage and liquid industrial waste. So gray water is what comes out of the shower, out of the tap, from cooking, right? So washing, bathing, and cooking out of your washing machine. That's all considered to be gray water because it should lack any sort of fecal contamination. So anything contaminated with feces is called sewage, whether or not it's animal or human. So there's a difference between, for wastewater treatment facilities, there's a difference between what comes out of your shower drain versus what goes down your toilet. So wastewater treatment involves, if you've ever been to a wastewater treatment facility, giant buildings. So this industrial size facility full of microbes for treating the water. And the goal for treating the water, there could be two goals. The first goal could be to release it into surface water. So they would want to treat the water sufficiently so that there is no or very little pollution and very little what we call coliforms or fecal bacteria in the water. And then it can be released into a river, for example. Or we may want to have that water of sufficient quality so that we could send it to a water purification facility so that it could be used for drinking. So there's a difference between the water that would be released into a river and the water that will be sent to drinking facilities. But overall, the goal of wastewater treatment is really the same no matter what kind of facility we're talking about. Reduce the amount of contaminating material, whether or not that's organic or inorganic waste, so that you no longer support microbial growth, and so that you remove any potentially toxic materials. You don't want to be drinking fecal bacteria. You don't want to be bathing in pesticides. You also don't want to bathe in fecal bacteria or drink pesticides, right? All of those things need to be taken out of your water. And so we talked about this term before, the biological oxygen demand. And so this is a term that is used in industry, is used in those wastewater facilities. You want to reduce the biological oxygen demand, because the biological oxygen demand is a metric that tells you how many microbes are in that water sucking up whatever's in there and sucking up the oxygen at the same time. So if the biological oxygen demand is low, the assumption of the facility is that the microbial contamination is also low. It means that whatever is in the water is not enough to support microbial growth, or at least to support a lot of microbial growth. If the biological oxygen demand is high, that means there's probably a lot of organic material in the water, and it's providing a food source for the microorganisms. So this is a real-life application of understanding biological oxygen demand. Okay, so very generally, we'll talk about what goes on in a wastewater facility. I know here the ecology class is too large. There are too many lab sections. But when I was an undergrad at Stanislaus, every semester we only ran one ecology section. And so for our field trip, we went to the sewage treatment plant in Turlock to learn how it worked. And I also took ornithology that semester, and we went to the sewage treatment plant to see the birds. So I was like, wow, I ended up at the sewage treatment plant twice in one semester. Lovely. Now I voluntarily go to the one out here because there's so many good birds. They're very cool in terms of the wildlife they support, the processes they do, and actually, as much as you would think, yay, a giant facility that has all of Fresno's sewage, you would think that would really stink, but it doesn't. You can't really smell it because they keep all of the really nasty stuff inside. And by the time that it's released from these facilities, it's had all of that organic material removed. It doesn't smell. You've removed most of the microbes. And so you have water that I wouldn't drink it, but it's also not completely disgusting. So one of the first things that comes in when the water comes in is screening and sedimentation. You got to remove the solids. So whatever has come through the water or come through the pipes as a solid has to be removed. And one of the things that humans have started to do that has really made sewage treatment complicated is the use of wipes, right? Those like the flushable wipes. They're flushable, which means they won't clog up your pipes, but they don't really degrade, and so they get caught on stuff. You can Google the Fatberg in London. It was like tons, literally tons of those wipes and like toilet paper and sewage that just all got clogged up together in the pipes. So just because it says flushable doesn't mean, it just means it'll go down your pipes. It doesn't mean it'll degrade. So you have to remove things like that. Or if you were like my brother, he would flush, I don't know, anything down the toilet because it was fun. Oh, there goes a banana peel, right? He didn't like to eat, I don't like bananas either, but that's how he got rid of them. I would just throw them away. So whatever your kids flush down the toilet, there's your car keys, right? Whatever gets dropped down the sewage, right? So that has to be screened out. And then things like fecal matter or toilet paper, which actually do break down pretty well, they're allowed to sediment. So they settle to the bottom. And once they sediment, then you have, they call it sludge. So you can have anaerobic digestion of the sludge, microorganisms breaking down that organic material, right? Toilet paper is just paper. It's carbon, so they can break it down. And of course, fecal material can be broken down. That sludge can then be removed. It can be dried. It can then be, of course, incinerated, buried. It can be used as fertilizer. We don't do that in this country. We don't use human waste as fertilizer. In other countries, if you ever hear of anything called night soil, that's human waste. Please don't eat crops grown in night soil. Okay. You also can have aerobic oxidation. This serves more as a disinfection. It can help remove any potentially contaminating organisms. And then you have activated sludge and aeration. So you have this like trickling type filter, which we'll see on the next slide. And that water can then go to secondary treatment. Okay, so you have these ponds. By the time you have these ponds, you really have the removal of a lot of the stuff that makes sewage sound so icky. And so you get aeration through to support the growth of aerobic microbes. Here's where you have this sludge that kind of settles and can be moved out to be digested. So if you ever do go out to the sewage treatment facility, it's out off 180 by Mendota. It's a really giant facility. It doesn't smell, I promise. There are birds and bugs, and they're happy to tell you how their facility works. But it's a really, really critical process we have. So here's where it's really gross, is inside of these tanks. That's why it doesn't smell bad at these sewage treatment facilities, because here is where you have kind of the scum layer. That sounds lovely, right? The actively digesting sludge, the stabilized sludge, and they do have some gas outlets to release any methane or carbon dioxide. Because as you can imagine, right, all of these processes produce a lot of gas. And so that gas is released through the top of up here. And then you have all of these different reactions occurring inside of there, where you're breaking down the polysaccharides, the lipids, the proteins. You're breaking down them even further into things like acetate, methane, carbon dioxide. Okay. And so you have your anaerobic zone, your aerobic zone. You get a lot of mixing. And so you have the degradation of things like short-chain fatty acids. These volatile fatty acids, that's a lot of what makes things smell. Those short-chain fatty acids have an unpleasant, to most people, odor. And so by removing those, right, you see the concentration goes down. And so you just have this water that comes out through every step that's cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. Okay. And so, of course, you wouldn't want to drink the water that directly comes out of there, but that water can then be sent to a drinking purification facility, or it could be potentially put back into a river because it's free of fecal contamination. But we now have, again, because of human activity, novel types of contaminants that are entering the water supply. So these wastewater treatment facilities are designed to handle either human waste as sewage or industrial waste. And depending on the types of industries that are in certain areas, these facilities will be designed to handle those particular types of waste. But what we have now are these compounds that are bioactive even after the wastewater treatment process. So things like pharmaceuticals. So all of the drugs you take, if you read the mechanism of action, a lot of the drugs you take are excreted in urine and feces. So those drugs enter the water supply. Other personal care products. So that one of the big ones are those little little microplastic bubbles that are in things like soaps and body washes. Those don't really biodegrade, and they enter the water supply. Household products. I scrubbed my bathtub yesterday, and so there goes the Ajax right down the drain. Okay. Sunscreen. Whatever you've got on your body, right? So let's say you went to the beach, you put on your sunscreen, you came home, take a shower, that sunscreen goes in the water supply. We don't have the ability to degrade those compounds, and so we have to think of new mechanisms. Maybe we have to find microbes that can degrade these compounds and put them in the treatment facility so that we can get rid of those. But things like antibiotics in the water supply lead to antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the water supply. You're like, well, why are there antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the river? That's so weird. Because all the antibiotics you excreted in your urine or in your feces are in the water supply. Shocking. Okay. So these can cause major issues. So that wastewater, I think I already mentioned, is not yet fit for human consumption. Not potable. So whenever you see a do not drink non-potable water, don't drink it. It's this kind of water. I mean, you can, but it's not recommended. It's not quite yet got all of the nasties removed. But you can use it for watering. So whenever you see a sign that says, like on the sprinklers, like non-potable water for irrigation, don't drink it. Okay. Further treatment removes additional pathogens, improves taste and odor, and tries to reduce chemical load, and also tries to decrease turbidity. Right? If you took water from a tap in a nice clear glass and that water was cloudy, you probably wouldn't drink it. So that's turbidity. You want your water to be clear. We're very, very particular. We don't want it to smell weird. We don't want it to have colors. We don't want it to have bacteria. And we don't want it to be cloudy. And so a typical drinking water treatment facility will purify raw or untreated water. Okay, so this raw water thing, have you guys heard of this raw water that people are drinking in Silicon Valley? Yeah, they're like, they pay $60 for like a gallon of water because it's raw water. More money than brains. So first of all, this raw water, if you picture, I'll show you this. We picture, here is a drinking water and wastewater treatment facility. So I read this article about these dummies in Silicon Valley buying this $60 a gallon water that's raw. They buy it from Oregon. And so basically what happens is in this area in Oregon, the way that they process their drinking water is they get it from the river. It's piped into a building. And inside the building, they do all the water treatment. So the raw water is basically, they show you pictures online of like some guy like with a jug in the river, like getting your water, which is not what happens. They actually just, so the pipes bring it into the building and then it goes into the treatment. There's a little spigot right here before it goes into the treatment. and that's where they fill up your $60 a gallon jug of water. So it's from the water treatment facility. But they're like, oh, it's so healthy and it's a great health benefit. So I'm like, oh my God, if you leave it if you leave it out, it starts turning green because there's algae in it. It's from a river in Oregon. Does a bear poop in the woods? Yes. There's a really great video online of a bear running around in Washington State with like a 5-foot tapeworm hanging out of its butt. Giardia. So it's like a self-selection thing for me. I'm like, well, $60 a gallon for Giardia, that's fine. Okay. So please don't do that. Don't be the Silicon Valley folk. I hope one day you do have enough money to buy $60 a gallon water. Don't. But I want you to have that much money. Okay? But I also want you to have some common sense. And just drink normal water, please. Okay? So in these facilities, what you have happen is, again, you want to remove any sort of insoluble material. You want to remove microorganisms. You filter to remove any sort of other particulate matter. You remove most of the organic and inorganic compounds. And then you try to kill the remaining microorganisms and prevent growth of new microorganisms. And in drinking water treatment facilities, we usually accomplish this through chlorination. So they add chlorine to the water, to the drinking water, to keep microbial growth down.
Is that why when you go out in the woods, like the middle of the woods, and you get river water, they suggest you to bring those chlorine tabs?
Yeah, so if you go out into the woods, you go camping, and you're going to drink that nice clear, crystal clear river water, yeah, you can get chlorine tabs. Often even filtering is better than nothing because you can remove things like Giardia, which is really common, or boiling. Yeah. All of those things help. I mean, chances are you're probably going to be fine, but how terrible would it be to be on your week-long camping trip and to get Giardia? So those of you who don't know, Giardia it's what we call a fatty diarrhea. The parasite blocks fat absorption, so every time you defecate, big chunks of fat come out with it too. It's supposed to smell amazing. That's why I don't work in clinical medicine. Okay? So you shouldn't drink untreated water. Plus, especially if you grew up here, your guts can't handle it. Weak American guts. Okay, it's true. That's why they always make fun of us. When you go to foreign countries, they're like, oh, I got the traveler's diarrhea, huh? That's why they call it traveler's diarrhea. Because people who live there, their gut microbiome is acclimated to that. Weak American stomachs, we can't handle it. Okay? The other thing we have to think about is how does our water get to us? So it's at this water treatment facility. We've got this nice pure water, maybe slightly chlorinated. You hope not too heavily because that tastes gross. It's like drinking pool water. How do we get the water to us? Well, we do not go to the water treatment facility and load up our buckets. It gets piped to our houses. So there will be city-maintained pipes. That'll be your municipal pipes. And then there will be the pipe system within your house, which are your domestic pipes. Okay? And so we have to consider a lot of different factors. Again, we, as people who especially have grown up with treated water, expect treated water. We expect it to really not have a taste. Water should be fairly tasteless. We definitely don't want it to smell. We don't want bacteria growing in it. So we especially don't want pathogenic bacteria. We definitely don't want antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that's a really delicate balance. The more chlorine you add to the water supply, the fewer pathogens you get. So that's good. But chlorine stinks. That's bad. Chlorine doesn't taste good to most people. So that's bad. So where do we have this perfect balance of stopping pathogen growth but having appropriate taste and odor? We really don't, right? That's why every town has its own little quirk with the water supply. If you grow up in one place, you probably are used to the tap water there. You move somewhere else, you're like, you're not used to it because they treat it in a different way. Right? I didn't grow up here. Fresno water tastes weird to me. I go to my parents' house, love it. Turlock water is great. Okay? Fresno water is weird. San Antonio water is weird. Coastal water is always weird. Tastes too salty. Okay, so you have all of these issues of water treatment, and so you get used to the water where you live. But to prevent microbial growth, that's really the key thing. Right? If everybody in the town was drinking fecally contaminated water and all got some sort of illness, that would not be very good. And so removing pathogenic microorganisms is really critical. So you have to try to remove all of the nutrients. If there's nothing in the water for them to consume, they shouldn't be able to grow. And then you have to maintain that appropriate residual chlorine level. There are certain pathogens that when they get in chlorinated water, if that water isn't like burn your eyes chlorinated, it won't inactivate the pathogen. That's why at public pools, they're like, if you've had diarrhea in the past 2 weeks, please don't come swimming here. Because things like norovirus and rotavirus need burn your eyeballs chlorine to inactivate them. So if those got into our drinking water supply, the chlorine level is not nearly high enough to kill them. But a lot of bacteria like E. coli and salmonella and cholera, you just have to keep the chlorine level high enough to keep those down. But nothing is perfect. You're not going to remove all of the organic material from the water, and you're not going to be able to always maintain a high enough level of chlorine because people won't drink the water if it's too chlorinated. And we do find opportunistic pathogens in water distribution systems. We also find what we call grazing protists. It's like amoebas. So you've probably all heard of the brain-eating amoeba, Naegleria fowleri. That is sometimes found in the water supply. That's why they say if you use one of those neti pots, to clean out your sinuses, to not use tap water, because that amoeba is found in the tap water. Or if you are going to use tap water, that you boil it. Because those organisms can survive in the water system. We don't have high enough chlorine levels. Other pathogens that can be found in water supplies include Legionella pneumophila. So Legionella pneumophila is the cause of Legionnaire's disease, which has, they just had an outbreak recently that killed a bunch of people. I don't remember where, somewhere on the East Coast. But the Flint, Michigan water supply is also contaminated with this, Legionella, because it lives inside of the amoebas. Okay, Pseudomonas species that cause really significant opportunistic infections are commonly found growing in hospital water supplies. Mycobacterium, so tuberculosis, leprosy, those types are also found in the water supply. And lots of opportunistic pathogens are enriched in your shower heads. It's nice warm water. And how many times? When was the last time you put cleaning solution inside of your shower head? That you dunked your shower head in like bleach or whatever. Yeah, okay. See? Yeah, I do because I'm paranoid about everything. It was last week. I'm good. I'm glad I made all of you paranoid. Take off the shower head, dunk it, right? It's gross. Okay. So that brings us to homes. Nowhere is safe, unfortunately. My house is safe because I'm like, oh my God, everything is gross. So we spend the majority of our time inside, right? Especially here in the summer, it's like, it's so hot, right? We stay inside. Now it's too cold, so we stay inside. And inside are microbes. And so we now have this microbiology of our houses, basically. We have bacteria inside of the air, in the dust, on surfaces, in our ventilation systems. And so what we then have is this idea that we basically protect ourselves, and we put ourselves in a bubble. And so I was lucky. I grew up right before like kids were supposed to be clean all the time. My mom was like, yeah, go play. And I'd come in just covered in dirt. My mom was like, that's fine. Here's the dog, play with the dog. And now everybody's like, ooh, I gotta like wet wipe my kid. Like they, I don't know, bleach their kid or something. So you decrease overall microbe exposure, okay? But then that leads to allergies. So now, poor kids are like allergic to everything. So that they call it the hygiene hypothesis. You're so clean that your immune system never learned how to deal with anything. So go play in the dirt. Go kiss a dog, a nice dog. Right? Pick up the cat. So here you go. You have microbes everywhere. They come in your window, they come out your tap, they're covering you, they're on your light switch, they come out your ventilation system, they're on your dog, they're on your doorknob, they're on your keyboard, they're on your cell phone. Cell phones are the nastiest thing like ever. Don't swab your cell phone. You don't want to know. Okay? And so in the home, it's predictive of the family. And when people come in and out of the house, like when residency changes, somebody moves in or somebody moves out, the microbiology of the house changes with that person. And then I'm going to leave you with this. Flushing a toilet can release 100,000 small bacteria into the air, which can then transmit enteric or fecal bacteria from person to person. So if your roommate flushes with the toilet seat up, you should keep your toothbrush in your room. Because that's where it's going to land, is right on your toothbrush. 2 meters around your bathroom. So next time you clean your bathroom, don't forget the walls and the ceiling.